asking today, how long will it take? Somebody's asking, how long will prejudice blind the visions of men? I come to say to you this afternoon, however difficult the moment, yes, sir, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth crushed earth will rise again. Yes, sir. How long? Not long. Yes, sir. Because no lie can live forever. Yes, sir.
Martin Luther King Jr., a name synonymous with peace, understanding, and nonviolent action. A man who clearly saw a future that many couldn't or wouldn't imagine. A man most often quoted in times of turbulence, but maybe also a man who has been mischaracterized. You see, there's so much more to Martin Luther King Jr. than his "I have a dream" speech.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
King weighed in on the nation's war effort.
I speak out against this war, not in anger, but with anxiety and sorrow in my heart, and above all with a passionate desire to see our beloved country stand as the moral example of the world. I speak out against this war because I'm disappointed with America. And there can be no great disappointment where there is no great love.
The rights of the nation's working poor.
Through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. Now, this is what we are faced with, and this is a reality. Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
Tonight, amidst the violence and uncertainty of the country's current convulsions, we're going to discuss the king that is often glossed over, the radical king.
According to a December 1st, 2017 article published in Time magazine titled "The Only Thing Donald Trump and Martin Luther King Have in Common" by Tavis Smiley. Smiley references a Harris poll, in which I have studied as well, that states in the year in which King was assassinated, 75% of Americans deemed King an unacceptable leader, with 60% of Negro respondents in lockstep with the assertion that King was unfit to lead the movement in which he had become the face of 13 years prior. As a student of history, you are not only keenly aware that peaceful and nonviolent disobedience led by King that didn't bear an inkling of the vitriol of hate that the insurrection presented us with 3D, that was met with fire hoses, dogs, and state-sanctioned officers who killed with racial venom. Can you discuss the ways in which Black and brown bodies would have been received at the Capitol on the 6th and the political, social, and financial fallout that would follow the presumed leader?
Wow. Thank you so much, Tony, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. I especially want to thank the committee for putting this conversation together. I'm so thrilled to be here, and I'm so thankful to learn from all of you. That is a real powerful question that so many of us have been contending with ever since we saw the violence at the Capitol. All of us who are part of any movement that has had the hearts and minds and futures of Black and brown people, and in particular, Black people, know that should have we shown up at the Capitol in those ways, we would have died, period. That there would have been massive loss of life. And this has been said over and over again, but I think that sometimes what's left out of the discussion is the history of violence by the state towards Black, Indigenous, and brown bodies when we protest peacefully. That this is not new. So our common response of saying, if it would have been BLM, if it would have been Indigenous people, there would have been lots of murders, is not just an emotional response, it is a historical response, right? Because we have seen this time and time and time again. I mean, the participants and the panelists are here because we care deeply about racial justice. And we know that our brothers and sisters are murdered, right, for being asleep in their houses. So imagine, right, what would have happened if we showed up armed to take down the government. None of this is surprising to people that study. So one of the things that I've been deliberating is the shock. Right? Like, what makes us, right, so surprised about what we saw when we know, right, that mass lynchings in the United States had audiences, right? Like, none of this is new. None of this is new. So I appreciate the question, because I think the questions takes us to a history of violence against Black and brown people that is state sponsored, that is institutionalized, that is reproduced. And when we put these images in contrast, it illuminates the knowledge that we already know. Right, that there's an unequal system. I just want to say before we pass it on to the next person too, please. One of the things I've been really thinking about are our Indigenous brothers and sisters, right? With all of their protests to protect our water, because water is sacred, and the police, like, and the military trying to incarcerate, to hurt these young people who were literally protecting water. Right. Let's put that in conversation with what we saw at the Capitol.
Awesome. Blaine, once again, happy birthday. Educators, like our health professionals, have been confronted with the moral conundrum in these dark and uncertain times. Each of you have been charged to serve as the moral compass to families, students, and society as a whole, while simultaneously acting as an emotional gatekeeper for yourself and those closest to you. King eloquently reminds us as to why we must leverage the classroom to serve as one of the vehicles of change for our young people. King states, the function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. Would you discuss how the schoolhouse could properly use the teachings of King to help our students understand the richness of his legacy and thoughts, while providing a context of the world in which they are charged to navigate today, ranging from the perception of the BLM movement to the riots on the Capitol?
It's a big question.
Well, you're the birthday girl, it's a gift to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think I want to start with building off of what Melissa was talking about in terms of state-sanctioned violence. We see state-sanctioned violence happening in schools and not upon the body, but upon the minds of young people. And so I think the kind of straightforward answer to your question is that we need to teach to think critically and intensively about the world. That is what education and curriculum and decisions about pedagogy should be grounded in, baseline. I think that what we are seeing in the midst of this pandemic is the wrestling between clinging to the normal and what was, because everything feels so up in the air right now, without the recognition that the normal was harmful. And so what I think we would be urged to think about now, if Dr. King were watching this situation, is how do we use this time to leverage for change that needed to happen before COVID? And that has just been laid bare in a different way, maybe for some people. Although if you have worked in schools for a long time, you see the same things playing out now as played out before the pandemic hit. And so I think this notion of engaging students in making sense of their world, engaging students in asking, why is the world this way? How do we use school as a place to design a world that isn't like this? There's so much promise in that. And yet we are told that that is radical and that that is problematic and that that is dangerous. And I think that's a problem.
Thank you. We're going to stay with this in the school space. Aisha, welcome. Did you? You here? She's here?
Yes,
okay.
I'm here.
She's here. All right. Thank you. Thank you for coming out. As a policymaker, you are uniquely positioned to implement a number of the items that Blaine just highlighted, right? Last week, Laurie Lander hosted a call with a number of organizations that have a long history of leveraging the schoolhouse to support young people with unearthing the tough questions that we as adults still struggle with. One organization in particular, Facing History and Ourselves, would be a phenomenal resource for our schools, educators, and students. For the district-wide implementation. In addition to that, the New York Times Magazine 1619 project, in which the article written by the project's primary editor, Nicole Hannah-Jones, examines her internal struggles and the dichotomy that she and her father shared as it related to the American flag hanging outside of their home. I refer to this passage of the flag because both the American and Confederate flags were prominently on display on the 6th, leaving many of us to wonder what America we truly reside in. Could you discuss your position on the adoption of a district-wide curriculum such as the 1619 project, and if you believe a robust partnership with an organization such as Facing History and Facing Ourselves is on your radar?
Thank you so much for that question, Tony, and thank you for inviting me to this space. Really a pleasure and an honor to be here amongst all of you all and with our audience members. You know, there are so many partnerships that are on my radar in terms of how we create a robust educational plan and curriculum for our students, all of our students, but one that really looks and hones in on the richness of our community. And so when we think about creating curriculum, we need to celebrate the and speak transparently around the BIPOC community and the challenges that BIPOC individuals face and have experienced. And so if that's partnering, so I think that there needs to be several levels of the partnership, and maybe that's in stages, whether it's elementary, upper school, or high school, but we need to look at what that can, the richness of what that can bring across all those levels. And so partnering with 1619, I mean, Tony, you and I have had an in-depth conversation about that. And, you know, we are nestled in with great Ivy League schools, Harvard and MIT, where there are tremendous scholars that come into our community and do their great work and then they leave. But how can they impact and do more with our young people and with our educators so that we can create a robust program that lives on, right? And I think that that's really what we need to be honing in on. I think that's what we need to be embracing. That is my work as a policymaker, as a school committee member, to really work with our curriculum leads, admin teams to really think about how we are embracing and addressing, our curriculum, looking at our library, textbooks, all sorts of things, because it doesn't just start with one place of curriculum. We really need to bring in a whole bunch, because again, the celebration of Black and Brown individuals is really working with a lot of organizations to really think about how we do this thoughtfully, how we do this with great intent, and how we make sure that it's something that is sustainable. And that to me is something that is important. And that to me, especially in this pandemic, as we know, this was critically important when we were kids in our high school,
Right.
living in Cambridge, growing up, that this was important back then. This is critically important now. And so it's
Right.
really how we look at our budget, how we look at embracing the partnerships that we can have. And, I think the 1619 is a powerful tool and resource along with others. And so we just need to think about, how do we weave that in? How do we do it in phases? But, what's best for our elementary kids, and where do we kind of bring them in at? What's best for our middle school kids, and then what's best for our high school kids, and make sure that it's done with thoughtfulness, and make sure that our educators are trained with a critical racial lens to make sure that they can do that in a competent way and being culturally competent in that process. So I think that it's really important that we bring in those high level curriculum into our schools.
Thank you. Frank, Melissa tapped into something particularly around the body that I want to get your thoughts on. So Frank, the events on the Capitol have reinvigorated the discussion of how Black bodies are treated currently and have been treated historically. The brazen in which the rioters stormed the Capitol while leaving untouched is unbelievable and quite frankly heart-wrenching. As you are fully aware of, Bull Connor, the Arch City Segregationist Commissioner of Public Safety of Birmingham, would order that nonviolent protesters be mowed down by the streams of fire hoses. My aunts would often tell me the images of the acts of rogue and inhumane policing would scar them mentally for years and leave them afraid to visit family in the communities in which they have come from, particularly in the South. As a therapist, can you discuss the social and emotional impact that the images and videos of the Capitol will have on our children and families moving forward? And can you provide us with an example or two on how to cope through these trying times?
Yes, good evening. First of all, let me say that welcome, beloved community of Cambridge. First, let me start off by saying, in following in the African tradition of acknowledging our ancestors who came before us, may our ancestors' energy, spirit continue to be our source of healing, empowerment, care, and renewal in our everyday lives. So on to your question, Tony. It is often said, Dr. King said that he talked about the three evils, and the three evils were racism, poverty, and war. I would like to say add the seven injustices that comes under the word justice, which is Jim Crow, urban renewal, slavery, terrorism, incarceration, cops, and economic exclusion. What we seen January 6th is only part and parcel of our history. I want to be clear and have people really understand this when I say this. When racism, which is white supremacy, tells a perfect lie, the truth is unbelievable. Say it again. When racism, which is white supremacy, tells a perfect lie, the truth is unbelievable. And so we had over 73 million people that supported Trump, co-signed and conspired to insurrect in an insurrection in the U.S. Capitol, and it only reinforces what Black and brown people know about this country. That display remind me of my nursery rhymes back in kindergarten with Humpty Dumpty. You know, Humpty Dumpty fell on the wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king horses and all the king men couldn't put racism America back together again. So we need to first start with that premise. And how do we do that? We first must unlearn in order to relearn. You know, truth sounds like hate to those who hate the truth. And so when we talk about the display that went on, not only it traumatized our children, it continues to reinforce under the system of white supremacy that it's okay to have Black and brown people suffer. We, in my opinion, and as a counselor, we as Black and brown people are not suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome, better known as PTSD. The truth is we are suffering from continuation, re-traumatization, and racial battle fatigue. Nancy Pelosi went on today and talked about a lot of her Congress people feel traumatized. We've been traumatized over 401 years. Where's the outrage and where's the support of that? So to answer your question, Tony, our children are traumatized, and we as adults are re-traumatized. And under the system of racism, white supremacy, that is their goal and objective to, they can't afford, powerful people cannot afford to educate the people they oppress. But because once you educate the oppressed, you will not have to ask for the power, you take it. That was by historian John Henrik Clarke. And this is what's resurfacing in a continuation of the emboldenment and in the acknowledgement of racism and white supremacy.
Tony, you're muted.
I'm having a Teddy Riley moment over here. I heard my screen was a little messed up, but it's all right. I want to stay there for a second and actually want to kind of tackle some of the things that you said and go back to Blaine as she was mentioning BLM. So as an assistant principal, Blaine, you are charged with supporting educators and students to tap into their curiosity. As you know, King's work generated a cohort of younger leaders such as Stokely Carmichael, who would later become Kwame Ture, Diane Nash, and John Lewis, many of whom were the same age of the young people on the ground exposing our country's current dark history and racial warts today. These young people, like King, believed, never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. So I asked that, Blaine, how do we leverage the schoolhouse to identify, to cultivate, and to elevate the next generation of leaders?
Really good question. And my mind goes first to a conversation that I had just this afternoon with a young lady, a sophomore at Revere High School, who sent me an email out of nowhere and said, this is the conversation I want to have. And so we had the conversation. I think the starting place is, and connected to what Aisha was saying, ensuring that educators and classrooms are people and spaces that invite the conversation about leadership, about challenging the status quo, about the evil of racism, about the necessity of school being a place where kids are not just learning ABC, which of course is important, but also cultivating skills to change the world. And I don't mean that in a corny kind of Pollyanna way, but the world needs to change. And the young people in our world today deserve to leave school and enter a world that doesn't look like, feel like, read like the world that we're living in today. And they know that. And so I think part of it is what happens in the classroom, of course. As a leader, it's making it explicitly clear that I both welcome and expect for teachers to engage in that work. And that is not a common scenario in schools. In fact, quite the opposite. We are told that we are rebel rousers when we open up those conversations. And you can learn the skills of kind of welcoming that as a compliment, but not everyone can, because sometimes it's the difference between a job or not. And it does reach that level. So I think about it from the leadership level, I think about it in the classroom level, and I think about it in connection to community and families, and establishing connection with families and community so that there is trust around having uncomfortable, loaded emotional conversations about real life, and that is not seen as trying to indoctrinate or cause harm, but rather help students develop the skills and build on the strength they already have to enter the world and change it. And that needs to be done intentionally. It doesn't happen accidentally. And it is not what curriculum in our capitalist America right now, that's not what curriculum is. And so there needs to be some rethinking on every level about how to create those spaces.
Thank you. So let's go to Aisha. In 1947, while a student at Morehouse College, King published an article in the campus newspaper in which he explicitly outlines his position on the role of education in our society. King outlines that a high quality education should focus on developing students' critical thinking and moral compass. As a policymaker for our city schools and someone who is keenly aware of the dreadful disparities that exist amongst our Black and Brown students and their counterparts, how will you work to put forth a policy agenda that protects the Black lives of our students and families?
That is a wonderful question. I think any policy that I work towards putting forth, really, I try to educate myself on where that's going to go, what are the next steps, who's going to be spearheading that in terms of leadership in our district. And so it has to, as we think about critical thinking and building our young people to be critical thinkers, it's important that we think about the policies of, I'm sorry, let me say this correctly, like the policies that are put forth, how they're going to actually make and shape without like spelling out the details of what I need you to do. Because what I've been learning, because this has been really a huge learning curve for me, is, staying out of the weeds, right? And allowing our experts who have their doctorates in education, who are our superintendents, assistant superintendents, whomever, to actually take some lead roles in working with our experts of educators to lead the charge of this work. So my goal and duty is, when I'm thinking about policy, is to also be working within our community, thinking about our stakeholders in the community, who could we be bringing forth in terms of partners in this work, and then thinking about some educators who I know can actually lead this work too. So I think that is going to be critically important just moving forward. And as we continue to build work that centers, especially the voices and the needs of our most marginalized students, that we're really thinking about who's championing that work within our school buildings today, right? And how do we partner with them in addition to our great, wonderful stakeholders to say, we know that we need all arms wrapped around doing this work. And that I think, through the lens of Dr. King, he was a community builder. He was a community activist. Like, he wanted to bring in a variety of different people, great people, to actually lead these charges. So, you can't do it in an isolated bubble. It definitely takes the community to lift up this work. And I'm not oblivious to the fact that a lot of people say things take time, but when we've been so marginalized for so many decades and centuries, we don't have that much time, right? And things need to be done like yesterday. So it's really thinking about who has that radical, the goal and the drive and the fire under them to actually lift up the work that we're about to move forward in. And I say, during this pandemic, it has given me a lot of hope, especially attending many of the COSBOX sessions and listening to different doctors, experts, scholars who are leading different charges across our country, and thinking about how could we bring that right here? What would that look like, not only in terms of curriculum, but also in terms of building a culture of how we continue to do this work, and how do we continue to center our communities, our stakeholders, our families, our children, and our educators in doing this work as a partnership. So, that's what I think is really important in terms of bringing forth any policy, is that we're looking into who are the people, the key stakeholders that are going to help to push these things forward and have that buy-in.
Thank you. You mentioned community organizing, and El Mahdi, you are a community organizer. You actually helped me understand the importance of organizing while at Morehouse. So Representative Holly, on February 18th, 2016, former President Obama hosted and praised the transformative work of the young activists of BLM and others, many of whom have reminded each of us for the need to have young people, particularly Black and Brown and progressives, at the proverbial table of justice. While doing this, he also acknowledged that he didn't always make a great effort of having these conversations around policy. As a policymaker, can you discuss the value add of bringing the voices of BLM, the Dream Defenders, and other organizations to the table, just as, not as we sometimes reluctantly, during the civil rights movement, organizations like CORE and SNCC were brought to the table. So El Mahdi, can you talk about the importance of bringing those folks to the table?
Yeah, absolutely. It's integral that you include organizations that are already on the ground. You know, we saw really a lot of the protest movements have been built upon a feeling. You know, you have to connect with people's real experiences. And many times these organizations, they just don't pop up out of nowhere. I mean, this literally comes from, it's a momentum that's built around citizens being able to have the full expression possible of realizing what it means to be a citizen, to be an active citizen. It requires you knowing that you have vested rights, that your tax dollars mean something, that there's a return on investment every time, you know, there's a little bit of money coming out of your check. Well, that's something that people understand on the ground. And, you know, I always tell my local constituents, just personally, I never want to live high on their tax supply. And, you know, but too oftentimes when we see that politics is being shaped from these, you know, these individual silos where oftentimes it's really just wealthy institutions backing a lot of candidates. Well, the tough part is that for the politics and the bread and butter issues that relate to the people on the ground who are forgotten in the shadows of our community, if no one comes to them and asks them to give voice to the direction through which the policy needs to change, through which their community is going to improve, to which they're going to have better access to opportunities, their careers are going to be, you know, moving forward, or even just very basic, right? I mean, let's talk in terms of the basic realities that we all saw with just 2020, one of the worst years possible. We literally had relatives dying and hospitals not being able to see everyone, you know, just because, you know, the pandemic. It's rough. And then we saw where a deadly pandemic was politicized, right? I mean, you know, this virus doesn't care about whether you're Republican or a Democrat. All a virus cares about is, can you be my next host? And so when we see that, you know, and then we look too at the, you know, it came right there on top of, you know, George Floyd's killing and Ahmaud Arbery down by me in Georgia, you know, where when we're looking on the books, it goes beyond just looking at it and say, oh, well, that's police brutality. No, the people, connecting to people grassroots, we've been able to go deeper. And then looking to the laws and realize, oh, wait, this citizen's arrest law through which, you know, this young brother got killed, this has been on the books since 1863. It literally is a slave catcher law. And so it's important not only to connect on a grassroots level so that we can understand the effects and the impacts and how it hurts people, but I think that this is all what we've seen in Georgia, and I think throughout the nation, but particularly here, is we saw that the momentum through which these people on the ground will create their own organization and then take advantage of the Citizens United decision that allows.
We lost them.
We're going to create our own pact. You know, put money behind it. But that if we focus on not just listening and putting our ear to the ground, but making sure that you now have putting money where your mouth is on our priorities. And that's what has changed the policy, because it allowed us to get people out to vote, but it also allowed us to change the agenda through which this nation takes our priorities seriously.
You said two things that really sparked my interest. So Melissa, particularly the idea of money, right? The corporatization of this, of this movement. Also, the idea you mentioned George Floyd. So a couple of things popped up. Melissa, after the state-sanctioned execution of George Floyd on May 25th, we witnessed a country who understood their pocketbooks were hemorrhaging, right? As a result of the international rebellion, corporations took it upon themselves to become an ally through corporate social justice, many of which even now think that MBK is a BLM organization, right? Because you have Black folks who are working with it and running it, which led to companies adopting the idea of BLM as a corporate gateway into saying, I am woke. Very much as we've seen the corporatization of Dr. King over the years. This is not new terrain to any of us, as we all witness under the corporate oligarchy in which we all live in. Can you discuss the dangers, if any, of corporate entities jumping into the social justice game?
Oh my gosh.
Wow, these questions are heavy, man. Woo.
Are we ready? Like,
and everyone can jump into that one. You can start it and you guys can jump around. But we'll start with you, Melissa.
I'm going to say, like, I'm woefully ill-equipped, right, to answer that question, because that is the question.
Right.
That is the question, right? And we have, in our lives, have seen the whitewashing of Dr. King, right? So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, are we going to see the whitewashing, or are we witnessing the whitewashing of BLM, particularly through capitalist endeavors?
Mm-hmm.
And we live in a capitalist society, right? So we are very aware of the social hierarchies that exist, right? And we're very aware of the fact that our folks, right, are worried about money and want to make money, right? So it troubles me. It unsettles me. I saw a commercial the other day online with McDonald's and Black Lives Matter, and I was shocked. I said to myself, is this where we are, right? But as an educator, I have also seen posters of Martin Luther King all over schools with very little reflection and action on MLK as a radical, right? So I'm very aware of this tension that exists on how BLM is becoming so mainstream, right? That people are making money off it. I mean, I get the ads on Facebook. I'm sure you do, with t-shirts, the face masks. And I'm like, who are these people? Who are these organizations? Who's making money off these movements, right? So these are really important questions. Like I said, I'm very ill-equipped, but I do want to say one thing that I think speaks to something that the representative and Aisha and Blaine and Frank all spoke to, right? And this is the idea of education, right? Whether it's organizing as education, which is in our ancestral traditions, right? We educated ourselves. Or whether it's like what's happening at the schools with principals and teachers, or what's happening at the policy level, or what's happening when it comes to taking care of our mental, physical well-being. So I'm gonna kind of tie the knots, because I feel like education continues, and this is something that I learned from Bell Hooks, a Black feminist scholar, who taught us, right, that the classroom, these are not my words, by the way, these are hers, the classroom remains the most radical space of possibility, the most radical space of possibility. The question, I think, and this is where we come back to Dr. King, the question I think that we need to consider is, what have we done to our educators? What have we done to our education institutions? What have we done to our community-based organizations? What have we done to our frontline providers? Can they still, does this radical possibility exist? And I'm just gonna close like with this, back to like connecting it back to this idea of capitalism and like buying movements and whitewashing movements. I think one of the things that I find most powerful about Dr. King's work is his commitment and that of millions of others who worked beside him to reimagine a future that they themselves were not going to see. Reimagine a future that they themselves were not going to see. Work towards a future that they themselves were not going to see. And we in this panel and many of the participants come from that legacy. My ancestors worked for a future of liberation that they themselves were not able to see. But yet here we are, right? Still working towards that. So when we think about capitalism and the justice movement and buying the woke movement, I wonder then if we're in a place where we're going to have to work, right? Like we have to reimagine these movements, even if we're not going to see them.
Right. So before I go on to Frank, and Frank, you can answer this after as well. Does anyone else want to jump in around the whitewashing and the corporatization of BLM, MLK, and or other movements before I move on to Frank?
Hey, Tom.
Yeah, I
just real.
No, Frank, you'll go.
Frank.
You'll go next. No, El Mahdi, you go, and Frank will go next because I'm going to ask Frank a question as well. So El Mahdi, you go first.
Okay, that's fine. And I'm being pulled in a different direction off onto. I got to jump off.
Okay.
But quickly, I wanted to be able to show that that for Dr. King's efforts, with organizing to make sure that it was the focus wasn't, when we look at Brown v. Board for 1954, that main decision which changed everything for our public education system. When they were originally bringing that up, it had very little to do with integration. It was more so there was a demand for the quality of education to be funded because we're in a capitalist society, to make sure that you could have Black students or students of color to be able to actually have access to the quality education. So, what we're seeing today is very much a long offshoot of that, whereby, the only reason that it got to be really a big problem is because now when you're asking for mutual funding for the same funding for those books, now have to be on par with everybody. That's when you have the system have a trouble for the system to actually be able to address the problems for everybody. So when we look at today, in terms of today's priorities, that's just something we're going to see, is the fact that anytime the people on the ground raise the level of consciousness up to where the system has to change, well, then the easiest way for the system to accept that is to find a way to monetize it. And if once they monetize it, it becomes something of a token. The challenge for us is, when we hold the feet to the fire, is to be able to identify in what ways our community is either not benefiting or benefiting, and to be able to say, we are now the ones who are going to be able to identify what the value is, rather than having you as the corporation with your beautiful commercials to tell us what the value is. If we hold their feet to the fire that way, then we got them.
Excellent. So Frank, you want to?
Excellent discussion, bro. Yeah.
Thank you for jumping on. Continue to do God's work.
No problem, bro.
So Frank, want to answer that first question, and I have a follow-up.
Yes. So what Representative Harley said was on point when he said about the system. So now we have to ask the question, what system? When you ask Aisha and the other ones about policy, what policy? Who runs and who controls the policy? And again, we have to understand racism, which is white supremacy. Non-white people are controlled through 9 areas or activities under the system of racism, white supremacy. And the 9 being economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. So the whitewashing is co-opted under the system of racism, white supremacy. There's a quote by M.I. Caesar that once said, which is so profound: everything which is done for us, but without us, has been done against us. None of the system under the system of racism and white supremacy didn't ask Professor Clark or Professor Cologne, what do you think about multiculturalism And what do you think about how can we empower Black and brown people? Just yesterday, the former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who's of Italian descent, said, and I quote, "Multiculturalism is not who America is." But no one challenged him. Why? Because of his whiteness and his privilege to say that. But if Minister Farrakhan said something like that, it would be on All News 24/7. Reverend Wright, the minister that presided over the Obamas, he just said, "Goddamn America," and he got ostracized by that. But you can have the former Secretary of State say that multiculturalism is not who America is. And furthermore, let me just extend that. Also, 2 days ago, before the Trump administration office left, they released a report, and this is for the educators. It's the 1776 Commission, and that the commission excuses slavery, justifies the racist Three-Fifths Compromise, and rails against socialism and, I quote, identity politics. This is from the commission in direct response to the 1619 project. So, we, as Dr. King said, we have some tough times ahead of us because of the ongoing struggles under the system of racism and white supremacy. This is what we're fighting for in education. And speaking of education, I'll leave it with this. Our educators, we don't educate our children. We indoctrinate our children. Carter G. Woodson said it best: when you control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions. So we don't have to know about 41 out of 56 white men signed the Declaration of Independence with slave owners. We don't want to know George Washington had 300 slaves. And we just had, not 20 days ago was New Year's Day. But historically, New Year's Day was nothing to be proud of as Black enslaved people, because they call that hiring day or heartbreak day. But you don't hear that in our history books, and you will never hear in our history books. Why? Because of the whiteness and the privilege of not putting that in there. So to answer your question about the whiteness, Tony, that's where I stand. Now your next question.
No, I'm actually going to follow up. I'm going to come back because I want two things I want to ask you. I want to kind of first start with Melissa because she brought something up, particularly on the front lines, I think was fascinating. So I'm going to start with you, Melissa, and go back to Frank. On February 12, 1968, 1,300 Black sanitation workers in Memphis began a strike to demand better working conditions and higher pay. The city of Memphis expected garbage collectors to work long hours for meager wages and without overtime pay. Their compensation was 65 cents per hour. That was so low that many were eligible for welfare and food stamps. Some would argue this charge was arguably the most unified fight for financial justice for workers of color as part of the civil rights movement. As a student of history, you are aware of this, particularly because MLK is often seen as the leader of this, which he was, one of many. However, I would like to discuss another king, his wife, Coretta. While we have tuned in this evening to discuss Dr. King, it is critically important to discuss his beloved wife, Coretta, whom he met in our backyard in Boston while she was a student at the New England Conservatory of Music, where she had, some have argued, even King in his autobiography had said she was more politically active than he was, as she was a member of the NAACP, a part of the pacifist movement, and also a member of the Progressive Party. I mentioned Coretta because while April 4th, 1968 will forever be imprinted in our collective psyches, and it was the day in which Martin Luther King was executed on a balcony in Memphis. But I would like us to remind each of you that another date is critically important to me. April 8th, 1968, which was just 4 days after her husband was killed, Mrs. King came to the place in which she led a march and spoke to an estimated crowd of 50,000 workers at Memphis City Hall, affirming that she was there to continue her husband's work on the behalf of the people. On this day, 4 days after her husband was executed, she said, "This nation can be transformed into a society of love and justice and peace and brotherhood." So I have a question for you, Melissa. As a community, can you discuss the ways in which our society can get out of our own way and celebrate and lift the genius of the voices of the women of the civil rights movement and the current movements of today?
Wow. First of all, I'm so grateful to you and to everyone who put this event together, that as we remember the legacy of Dr. King, we are bringing the work and influence of Coretta King into the conversation. That's something that is often unspoken of, unsaid, but always present, right? Behind every single civil rights movement in the United States, we have seen women lead, women taking care of community, and women 4 days later, as you said, 4 days later after his assassination, continue the struggle. This reproduction of like how gender plays out in civil rights movement is something that we're seeing today, right? Where if you look at what we consider some of the leaders of the movement has changed, right? But still, Kimberly Crenshaw and other Black feminist leaders and scholars have reminded us that we need to say her name, right? Just like you said, Coretta King, like we need to say their names as leaders, but also as people who have experienced the intersectional violence of what it means to be a person of color today. Now, I think that what some of the work that I do is really at like the nexus of gender, class, and race. So I appreciate like just pausing and recognizing that behind Dr. King's legacy, there was a woman and there were women, right, who made it happen.
You know, I want to stay in Boston because I think it's critically important, because when you read Dr. King's papers, both at the King Center and also BU, and I've also had the opportunity while a student to read them in college, some of them. But one thing that kind of strikes me a great deal about King, he talked a great deal about poverty, which is critically important that we reference. So Frank, in the 2017 Boston Globe Spotlight series, Achille Johnson examined the findings of a 2015 report by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, Duke University, and the New School out of New York City. The report spells out an American tragedy, one in which King warned us of in his teachings. The median net worth for non-immigrant African-American household in the greater Boston region is $8. Compare net worth for immigrants, $8 in comparison to $247,500 to its white counterparts. It is important to note that the report states that the net worth for Caribbean Blacks is $12,000, $3,200 for Puerto Ricans, and $0 for Dominicans. And the sample size for our Cape Verdean brothers and sisters was too small to calculate. During King's Nobel Peace Prize speech, he said the following: "The time has come for an all-out war against poverty." Along with the three major evils in which King speaks of, which are, as you mentioned earlier, Frank, the evil of racism, the evil of poverty, and the evil of war. So Frank, can you please discuss how Cambridge, a well-resourced city, can address poverty? It is important to note, according to the 2014-2018 American Community Survey, 13% of all persons, and this is also documented on the Cambridge Gov website, 13% of all persons and 7.4% of all families had incomes below the poverty line. Among families, 10.9% of with children under 18 and 29% of female-headed households with children under 18 fell below the poverty line in Cambridge. These numbers are critical, according to the U.S. Census the projections of the poverty rate in 2020 will be 9.2. How can we reframe poverty in Cambridge?
Thank you for the question, Tony. So let's be clear here when we talk about under the three evils, poverty, which is so under the system of racism, white supremacy, you can't have justice and white supremacy at the same time. So poverty is not, we cannot solve poverty in Cambridge. It's the lack of not wanting to solve poverty in Cambridge and elsewhere. So it's part and parcel of the system that we're under. In order for capitalism to work, somebody has to be poor. You can make no money off of peace, but you can make a hell of a lot of money off of war. And so that combination that Dr. King seen about the Vietnam War, he said it's unjust for him to talk about being nonviolent and peaceful when you have your own government, being implicit and complicit in your poverty. And poverty not only takes it away of food, it takes it away of justice, it takes away of politicians. I mean, during what King was amplifying was that under white supremacy we had the Klan. So now we went from KKK to PPP, and PPP is police, prosecutor, and politicians. This is the pipeline to prison incarceration. And how does that affect poverty? Well, you take the man out of the household and you imprison him. And so the wife has to go on welfare, which is owned and operated by the government. And the men that are incarcerated is in communities that is lack of people of color. So who are the probation officers? Who's are the prison officers? It's white men making money off of us. So poverty is more than just the enslavement of being poor or being in a position of being poor. It's constructed under the system of racism, white supremacy. So how can Cambridge help solve that problem? Number one, have a conversation with poor Black people and have that conversation about why are they poor and Black people. In Cambridge, we have a lot of Black and brown young men as we speak today that can't get a job in the city of Cambridge. Why? Some of the excuses that they use as well, they're not properly educated. Okay, then who are not educating them? The Cambridge public school system. So for me, Frank Bonds, I'm charging the Cambridge public school system with negligence and malfeasance, because it's unconscionable, to your point, to have Harvard on one end and MIT on another, and you have lack of solid education for our children. So they have to resort to community colleges, which is not a bad thing, which is actually a great thing, because they are still still learning, as opposed to being on the street and causing malfeasance behaviors. But we blame the student or the young man as opposed of them being put in the system of poverty.
You spoke to some, you actually mentioned the schools, and I'm going to come back to you. I have another question. But Aisha, I would like to read the remainder of the passage of the Nobel Peace Prize speech in which I started with Frank, which I referenced a little earlier with Frank. It continues to say, the rich nations must use their vast resources of wealth to develop the underdeveloped, school the unschooled, and feed the unfed. Ultimately, a great nation is a compassionate nation. Today, you sit here as a daughter of Cambridge and a member of the Cambridge School Committee. And in your role over the last 9 months, we have heard a great deal about the economic and racial disparities in our city as a whole, but throughout our schools specifically. As one of the leaders of the direction of our schools, can you share with us how you have or will champion a policy to address a strategy that addresses the facts that, according to the 2018-2019 CPS data report, 23.8% of the students in CPS are Black, and 13.7% are Hispanic, which more than doubles the percentage of Black folks who live in Cambridge and is several percentage points higher of their Hispanic counterparts. In short, would you consider adopting legislation that challenges our district to look at the scourge of poverty and how it impacts the education of our students, similar to a 2020 report, Vision for Berkeley's Children of Youth. And I mentioned Berkeley, California's system because it's often compared to Cambridge public schools because of the demographics of the city of Berkeley and the universities and the tech boom. So they wrote a report. The report is titled The 2020 Vision for Berkeley Children and Youth out of the Berkeley, California School District. So my question to you, Aisha, is how will you address poverty in your role as an education advocate?
Thank you so much for that question, Tony. And please send me that information from Berkeley School. I mean, I think
I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you. I mean, what is a tragedy is the fact that we have 60% children of color, and especially when we think about specifically our Black kids, you know, we have a target goal of 47% passing MCAS in the third grade, reaching proficiency in the third grade. That is negligent on its own. That is,
right.
You know, I think disrespectful to families, Black families specifically. And then when we look at kids who are on IEPs or what have you, the number is even lower than that. You know, we have to be a school district that thinks radically and, you know, going back to Melissa's point of reimagining education and thinking about our students who are performing the least are the students who need the most. And how do we actually put in that amount of work to make sure that, just like in any sport, you are just as strong as your weakest player, right? So we have to keep that mindset going as we think about education. It's, you know, you can't have 47 Black family out of 100 Black families and say 47 of you are gonna pass. What's gonna happen to the other 53% of those kids, the other 53 of those students? Right? Their families, the struggle. What does that look like as they matriculate from grade to grade with limited resources and lack of? You know, if we're not intentionally doing the work to make sure that our kids are successful in this rich resource place of Cambridge, where we're spending $30,000 per pupil, which is more than double what any other district is spending in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we are criminally setting ourselves up and setting our young people up for a disservice. And so when they go off to say even a junior college, which I went to a junior college and I'm fond of that and I'm proud of, and I encourage my young people to go that route before they go into a 4-year school. However, if you're going into those institutions and having to take remedial classes,
right,
that is again a disservice, and we have failed you as a district. If you have gone through our schools from K to 12 and now you are taking remedial classes in a junior college, we have failed you. And we deserve to we should take responsibility of that and have to pay for those classes for you because we did not prepare for you to go into those institutions. And that is our fault. And I know that under the leadership of former Mayor Mark McGovern, he was working on some policies around that with some previous school committee members. And I look forward to kind of getting back into that research of where are we with that information? What information was gathered there, and how can we move some things forward and have those intentional partnerships and work with our legal, you know, just really work through what does that look like? Because we know that too many of our kids go the junior college route, and they have to pay and suffer through that process, which ultimately makes them drop out because they feel inadequate. And that is not their fault when they have gone through our school system and was set up not for success in a school district that, you know, obviously does better for some and not for all. And so it's my role and responsibility. When I even ran for school committee, it was because as a kid growing up in this system, I saw the inequities and the injustices, and I wanted to make a difference, not because when I graduated 20 years ago, what I saw was happening then is still happening now 20 years later. And I want to make sure we're not still having this simple conversation. Because to me, it's that.
Real quick, Frank.
And I think that,
Frank, let her finish. And then,
thank you. And so I think in closing, I just want to say that it takes very ambitious individuals at this policymaking level to say we're no longer going to stand for that. And,
Right.
and a lot of people love to say these things take time, these things take time. But again, when we've been talking about it and having these conversations for decades, how much more time needs to be invested into the work that we already know needs to happen yesterday, right? And so that is my charge, and that is the work that I'm focusing on as we're into this new year, and as I'm seeking a new term for reelection and all that stuff, because I want to continue this work. And I do know that to a degree, absolutely, it takes time to do the work, but we have to do this work like it was like our own sons and daughters are, because it is. Our children of Cambridge are our babies, and we need to make sure that we're securing their future again for success, because they have been marginalized and harmed for way too many years.
Thank you. So Frank, I'm gonna give you 30 seconds, and then we're gonna get to Blaine and Melissa, and we're gonna open up for some questions from myself and the larger group. So Frank, you want to 30 seconds?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yes, and this is really passionate to me. So please don't mistake the passion in my voice for the lack of analysis. So Aisha made a lot of good points, but you got to take it a step further. And here's the step further. So if our students are not reading at that grade level, Black and brown children, the question shouldn't be why the children failing to read. The question should be why those teachers are not teaching those children to read. I have never met a kid that I have worked with, from head injured to compromising mentally. I have never met a kid that didn't want to learn. I never met a child who didn't want to take time to learn what's going on. So at some point in time, somebody has to take accountability and say, we are those teachers that are not teaching those children to read.
So let's stay in the schoolhouse, right? So let's stay near the schoolhouse. So Blaine, in a 1967 address at an Atlanta YMCA, King gave a speech in which he forged us to shift our collective thinking slightly by stating that the civil rights struggle needs to move and really look at decency and genuine equality. What is most fascinating about this speech, which you guys should look at, in my opinion, is that King implores us to put our money where our mouth is, as he would go on to say something similar to that of Bernie Sanders, and said it would require the government to spend billions of dollars to abolish poverty and provide high quality education while tolerating an inevitable backlash from white Americans. Can you discuss why you believe there may be a calculated strategy to not address poverty, which in essence impedes our most vulnerable and often Black and brown to not receive equitable educations in our country?
I think it is the foundation of this country. I mean, it is what Frank spoke to earlier, which is that were people to be empowered, right? I mean, why did we deny the vote? Why did we deny people the right to literacy? It is because there is the understanding that an empowered people run the risk of changing the status quo. That is, people said what happened at the Capitol the other day is anti-American. Challenging the status quo is anti-American. And so, yes, it is completely intentional that we deny people access to safe housing, that in neighborhoods where that happens, schools are inadequately serving young people. I mean, it is a network of harm and failure. And to go back to Melissa's term from the very beginning of this conversation, it is violence. Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about the slow death of young people. And you see the impact of economic violence, of educational violence, of identity violence and the denial of people's humanity. You see this play out every day in schools. And I think to Frank's point, what about educators teaching kids to read? While there are amazing educators that I have had and that I have the pleasure of working with, and some of them are on this call right now, teaching kids to read, teaching kids that they are magical and important and powerful and needed, that challenges the status quo. And so there's just this kind of, to use an overused term, ecosystem to ensure that we do not allow access at any level to Black and brown people in this country, because it would fundamentally shape America as white people know it. And that scares us, that scares white people. I say us, I think it's important to state the obvious that I am a white woman talking about this.
Tony, can I just amplify what you just said?
Give me
quick, this is 20 seconds.
All right, 20 seconds. 20 seconds.
20 seconds. And using Dr. King's quote, genuine equality will always going to be a much harder, longer struggle because white America is ambivalent about equality for others, unquote.
Thank you. What prefaced that quote, may I ask?
When she was talking about white people have not come to terms in dealing with having equality across the board. If you have equality across the board, you won't have poverty.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm gonna ask couple more questions, and I want folks to utilize the chat, put some questions in the chat. We can ask the larger group. I want to open this up after a couple of more questions. So I'm gonna ask Melissa a question. Melissa, in a 1962 speech in New York City to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Abraham Lincoln Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, King alludes to the need for each of us to begin to look at a third party and third-party candidates. King has been quoted as stating that the future should consider examining a progressive agenda. With your understanding of King and his views on poverty and other salient issues, what would King think of AOC and Sanders and others?
I'm not going to talk about Bernie Sanders.
Right, yeah, we're not going to talk about old white guys today. Talk about, Cori Bush. We'll put Cori Bush in there.
Yeah,
put Cori Bush.
Cori Bush.
Right, Cori Bush.
AOC.
Jamal Bowman. Let's all right, talk about it. The floor is yours.
I think King would hug and congratulate and mentor AOC. I think AOC in many ways spoke to this three evils that Frank has referenced in our conversation today, right? This idea of addressing racism, war, and poverty at the nexus. I think that King would urge her to continue to fight against these power structures. But I think above all, he would congratulate her on her visioning, right? Many of us are, I don't have a Twitter account or any of that, but I do follow social media very closely. And people talk about AOC like she is crazy, right? She puts these ideas out there hey, let's end college debt. Let's have a universal salary. Let's have universal health care. Let's have free testing for everybody. Let's have housing, high quality. She says these things and people think she's not. Literally, right? People on the right, and by the way, also people on the left. Because as Aisha was speaking to in terms of policy, right, they think that her approach is not politically possible and that she needs to temper herself. So I think in the spirit of reimagining a future that you yourself will not be able to see, I think that Dr. King would encourage her, for lack of a better word, to keep dreaming, right? And to keep fighting for that dream. Now, we can talk about AOC a little bit. I also wonder what AOC is going to be 10 years from now, right? When we talk about your previous question regarding capitalism and social justice movements, I wonder who she's going to be 10 years from now. I wonder if she ever decides that she's going to run for the big office, whatever that may mean for her, vice president, president, is she going to have to bow down to the two-party system? Is she going to have to do things that are against the ethos that she has today as a young person, right? So I think King would give us some AOC a big nod. And more importantly, I think King would give Cori Bush a big nod, right? Like it has been so powerful for me to see Cori Bush's development, right? As a BLM activist to being in Congress. And I am never, so I'm a Cantabrigian who unfortunately cannot afford to live in my own community anymore and had to relocate to Medford. So I live in Congresswoman Clark district. And I am never going to forget how my Congresswoman Clark said white supremacy, nobody booed. White woman from Medford. And then here comes Cori Bush and people are booing. Less than a week after the riots at the Capitol, right? So I think AOC would get an invite to dinner. And I think that Cori Bush would have his cell phone.
Awesome. So I'm gonna ask a couple of questions, and I want to encourage folks to place their questions in the chat, and so that we can bring some other voices to this conversation as we got about 30 more minutes with our esteemed panel. But I'm going to go back to Frank for a second, because you had mentioned something that maybe you don't remember, not on this call, but we were talking about it previously around elders. So Frank, it is highly documented that King didn't always see eye to eye with some of his comrades in the struggle, which included but not limited to Malcolm X, even at times James Baldwin, Fannie Lou Hamer, Stokely Carmichael, and at times even John Lewis. How do we use the institutional knowledge that we have here in Cambridge in the area of folks like Bob Moses, Carolyn Hunter, Mel King, and others to create a bridge from one generation to the next?
Thank you for the question, Tony. And I think that's going back to our historical Mother Africa, when they use the word Sankofa. In order to move forward, we have to understand our past. And that's incumbent upon the Black and Brown communities to reach out to the youth and to teach them their history. Let's be clear, this city is not going to teach our children Black history, period. And that's no indictment, that's just the honest truth, because the system, the way it's designed, is not paramount to educate our Black and Brown children. They don't want to know about their history. They choose not to talk about selections that's only incumbent upon that. I just think it's very disheartening to know that we still talk about Christopher Columbus like he was a great man. You know, it's still disheartening to know that we have to read books that insult Black and Brown people's intelligence, that continue to advocate for the whiteness and the privilege, and there is no education in regard to helping our Black and Brown children to not only empower themselves, but have strong self-esteem and have them believe in themselves, as opposed to what they see every day with the white images. So I think that it first begins with us as a community, and in a holistic, loving way, is to embrace our children and be honest and tell them about the truth about what's going on. You know, if you don't do good, you're doing injustice to humanity with its goodness. And I think that as a people, we have to solidarity reach out to our youth and help them. But just to touch back on the previous question you made to Professor Colon, and I think it's very, Dr. King was committed to racial and social justice for civil disobedience. But what he did, he shook the conscience of the nation. So the AOCs and the rest of those young females up and rising stars, they're shaking the conscience of the nation. And then they're doing it by, in the words of Malcolm X, by any means necessary. We have to come to the point and acknowledge that the system is under the system of racism and white supremacy is faltering. That's what you've seen on January 6th. They want their privilege back. They want to go back the way it was. And the country is multiculturalism and it's changing. And so we're kind of like during the civil past Reconstruction, Jim Crow, when our ancestors went through that trials and tribulations with Dr. King in the 60s. 2021, we're going through this transformation now. We're morphing more into embracing the melting pot. Is like Dr. King says, be promised to your word.
Let's stay right there for a second, because I want to get a couple more questions and then open this up. But yes, you want to add something to that?
For 1 second?
Yes,
I want to address something that's a person put on the Q&A.
Got it. Yep. I was going to say, we're going to move to the Q&A, and you put it in the Q&A chat. I'm sorry, I told you put it in the chat. So we're going to, can you see the Q&A?
I mean, I can, but I want to address the comment specifically that I think is really important.
Well, read it out loud. Can you read it out loud?
Sure, I'm going to read it out loud. So while I was talking about AOC, a person wrote, seriously, one of the most progressive people is Bernie. Where do you think those ideas come from? Bernie, right? So like, this is not a critique on Bernie.
Right. We're
really centering the lives, the experiences, the visions, the work of Black and brown people.
Right.
And I think it's completely misguided for anyone in this panel or in the participants to think that AOC, a Puerto Rican, poor woman from the Bronx, or Cori Bush, a first-generation, low-income, working-class Black woman from Missouri, that they get their ideas from Bernie. Like, that is centering whiteness to a degree that is unsettling and frankly offensive. As a Puerto Rican woman, like, AOC does not get her ideas of racial justice, environmental justice, economic justice, anti-imperialism, anti-settlerism from Bernie. She gets them from Black people, she gets them from indigenous people, and she gets them from the struggle of being a Puerto Rican woman in the United States. So that's what I have to say about Bernie.
And it's critically, I thank you for sharing. One of the things that I don't talk about it much, not that it's even important to this conversation, but I will mention it, is that I taught in New York City Public Schools, to be exact, for 10 years. And I specifically taught in the South Bronx, and I lived in the South Bronx. And one thing that I found in living in the South Bronx, there's an ingenuity and genius that's often ignored. And I think it's, to Blaine's point a little earlier, it's systemic, and it's in the way in which it's set up to be ignored. And so with that, thank you for sharing that. There's another question. I'm going to actually, pose this to the group. It reads, I'm interested in the panelists' thoughts about the necessity and or possibility of a mass state level Black history curriculum requirement. We'll start with that with Aisha, and then we'll go to Blaine, and then we'll go to Frank.
Sure, thank you, and thank you for that question. Yeah, I think that that's definitely something that needs to be worked on with some powerful educators, and just thinking in a holistic way about what it is that we're actually talking about, what it is that we're catching on to, and how are we going to, through bringing up the history, which is dark, right? But there's a lot of joy. There's a lot of things to be prideful about. There's a lot of things to celebrate. So how do we do that in a very, in a way that's going to be powerful, but just like come from, the educators that are around it, who are embedded in doing this work, who are scholars in this work from across our Commonwealth, to kind of come together to lead that charge. And I think that there's some powerful stuff that we can do there. And on the thinking of that, I just want to touch on Dr. Benita Love and her work around abolitionist teaching, and really thinking about how do we strip away from education as we know it to be, and really think about being freedom dreamers, right? And really think about that whole piece of reimagining education. And the reason why I really bring her into this space and her love for doing this work is because she was a hip hop scholar at Harvard, right? And so through the work that she did there, and she probably spoke at CRLS and whatever, but she talked about one thing of spirit murdering. And I think that that is something that happens with our babies every day in our schools, where their spirits are getting murdered. So when we talk, somebody mentioned this earlier in the conversation about how are babies going to school and hating school? How do you go to school and not enjoy school? It's because somebody done broke your spirit about what education actually looks like. School and education and learning should be fun, should be joyful, should be a celebration of just the beauty and education of learning. And yet I could talk to 6th grade educators who are like, by the time those babies get to us, they hate reading. They don't find it as joyful. They don't find it to be fun. And so I think that, again, if we really work as a community, as not only just the Cambridge district, but as a Commonwealth and as a nation, on how we celebrate and bring in Black curriculum, BIPOC curriculum in education and learning, so that it's joyful and we're seeing more of ourselves in the books, and we're talking about history, Black history, from in Indigenous history, from a lens of like, this is what happened. Let's take it in and recognize each other who are sitting next to you, Black, white, or brown. We need to be able to say, this was your history and I see you.
Let's stay there for a second. I want Blaine to answer that same question from her perch as an assistant principal, and then we're going to go to Frank as an activist. And then I'm going to kind of switch the question a little bit up from Melissa, as she's doing some really cool work on Facebook, documenting the experiences of students at Bunker Hill in this moment. So Blaine, how do we look at this from, are we ready to look at this from a curriculum standpoint, from a mandate throughout the state, or do we have to kind of start looking at it school by school first?
I guess Melissa is really resonating for me this evening, because I'm going to come back to something she said when she quoted Bell Hooks. The academy is not paradise, but learning is a place where paradise can be created. The classroom, with all its limitations, remains a location of possibility. I think in a world where public education in this state and in this nation, where that was the core truth, then I would want to have a conversation about a state-sanctioned Black history curriculum. But I use that term state-sanctioned very intentionally, because we have state-sanctioned curriculum and standards around reading, and yet we know not all kids are learning to read in our school. Why? We have state-sanctioned curriculum around pretty much everything that happens in schools right now. And it is the places where teachers dare to push back on that curriculum, sometimes at risk of their jobs, where in my experience in nearly 20 years in New York City, now in Revere and Dorchester and Lawrence, that is where learning is happening. And so I get scared about the commodification of Black history through the eyes of the state. That is different to me than, should Black history, AKA American history, be taught in every classroom? Yes. That shouldn't be decided through the state. That to me is more of a spiritual question of like, it is the right thing to do. It is a moral imperative. And so I worry about the state saying, here's what you have to do. The state tells us to do a lot of things, and it's not working.
Definitely. So Frank, from the perspective of an activist who's talked about the need for Black history in our schools, can you let me get your take on this. Take 60 seconds, we'll get back to the Q&A. Frank?
I'm sorry. So
want me to repeat the question?
No, I get it. So when it comes to Black history, this is what I say, is that what you do for yourself in large measure depends on what you think of yourself. So if you think that you have no worthy history, that you come from nothing, you will tend to act that out because you have a sense of identity. But if you think that you come from greatness, you will aim for the stars. This is not taught in our history classes. This is not taught in the curriculum. And I'm not generalizing. I'm saying as a whole in education. We are not teaching our children the wellness, their history. We go from slavery. We go from being enslaved into where we are now, and we call that progress. What we should be doing, and what we refuse to do, is that we don't take it from Africa, where even Dr. Leakey, a white man, said human bones first originated. We don't teach that to our Black and brown children. So they don't want us to have the self-esteem in the belief that they came more than just being enslaved people. And so I find it, very interesting that in our education system, for some reason, they refuse to acknowledge our African presence and the greatness that it contribute into how we got this far. When you talk about the Black and brown sisters that are rising up, that comes from Africa. They did more than just cook. While the men went out and did their thing in providing food and shelter, they educated their children. And so, and we see it now with these brave young women is saying they empower themselves because they want better for their children. I don't want Cassius, your son, to have a conversation with me later in life and he's saying the same thing I'm saying now. So we need to get to a point where we have to be honest with ourselves as a country. We need to be honest ourselves as a state. We have to be definitely honest ourselves as a city in saying just because we have Black people in high positions, that don't mean they're advocating for Black and brown children. That reading score that Sister Aisha just said signifies that. We have to do better. We must do better for the betterment of our children.
Melissa, you have any thoughts about this? I want to have a couple more questions, and I want you guys to go around and leave us with some thoughts before we get out of here. Melissa, any thoughts on a state-mandated Black history curriculum?
Lots of thoughts, but the most important one is I will follow the lead of Black people and what they want and what they envision. That's what I will support.
Okay.
That's full statement, period.
Well, let me ask you this question, because you're
the other thing I do want to say though is that I get them at the other end when they leave Aisha's work and when they leave Brank's work and Brank, we get them at the community college, and my students for the most.
Could you stop there for a second? Because I want you to say, because Melissa, like me, a lot of times I may get from people who say, well, Tony, and I'm just giving an example, why did you leave Hopkins, or why did you leave, why did you leave Columbia? And part of it was that I didn't feel like I was doing real work. And a lot of it was that I was getting emails from my students' parents, like, how dare you give my student a B? Oh, yeah. They've been a great student their whole life. So talk about how you leave, we leave these pursuits of tenure in all these places. You leave a place like Tufts, and why you went to Bunker Hill.
Sure. So I'll give the very short version. So I grew up in the projects in Cambridge, first generation Puerto Rican kid, Central Square, whatever. And I end up with a PhD in developmental science, being a researcher at Tufts in the Department of Child Study and Development, and like teaching some brilliant minds, brilliant, hardworking students, but students who have been given every single opportunity possible, and who the expectations of them are like unmeetable. I mean, I have never had as many students with mental health issues as I had at Tufts University. Well, maybe not, but because of this pressure to succeed. From the time they were born, they were told that they were going to be doctors and go to Harvard. And here they were, right at Tufts. And in my work, I teach a lot about schooling as a developmental context and social institutions for Black and brown kids. And my students were mostly white. And there was this disconnect. There was a disconnect. And I grew up in Cambridge when Cambridge was Black and brown, when Cambridge Engine Latin was Black and brown. And I wanted to be in an environment where I was with Black and Latino students thinking about these like big social questions and issues, and reimagining a path forward. And that's what I have at Bunker Hill. So that's like the amazing thing about being there. But one of the things that I have learned in my time at Bunker Hill is that there's a lot of unlearning to do. And this goes back to Mr. Barnes' point. So many of my students, including students from CRLS, their self-esteem. So at Tufts, everybody wants to be a doctor. Everyone wants to be a lawyer. Everyone has like these huge aspirations for themselves. And then at Bunker Hill Community College, a lot of students have been indoctrinized to believe that they're less than. I mean, constantly they say things to me like, Professor Colon, Dr. Colon, I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know I don't know what this means. I'm like, what do you mean you don't know? We're talking about race and racism. Of course you know. I mean, I'm a sociologist, right? So I'm like, we're talking about intersectionality. Of course you know. This is our lives, right? So it's like a lot of unlearning, a lot of repairing, right? A lot of teaching students how to do school, right? Like, why are we here? And frankly, and I don't want to get like, I don't want to age myself too much, but like the whole MCAS, No Child Left Behind, like it has developed a cohort of students who want to have the right answer. And they have been told through MCAS, through grades, through everything that they never have enough right answers. So they're mediocre, they're not good enough. And then in sociology, we're not really interested in the right answer. We're really interested in the questions, right? Like that one right answer, by the way, we actually don't think is right.
Right.
Reflection of like some ideology that is really like not important in this moment in time. So my work, and I think Tony would agree with me, like it's a lot of unlearning and a lot of like helping students understand their own brilliance. The last thing I want to say before I pass it on to someone else is that there's this wonderful metaphor that I'm sure many of us are familiar with. I cannot remember the name of the scholar right now, but he talks about the sorting machine, right? And how schools are like a sorting machine. And, you know, the most privileged get sorted into the institutions that have the most resources, and the people that have less get sorted into institutions that have less, and therefore into professions that will reproduce, right, these social hierarchies. And we see that, and we have to fight against it all the time. And as members of an education core, like, you know, we're in the reproduction machine. So we're trying to resist and like make little kinks so the machine doesn't work as well as it was designed to.
So let's, real quick, I'm going to go around. I'm going to ask folks to keep their comments to about 90 seconds. And then I want, we're going to close out. Each one of you will leave us with some wise words. So Frank, I want to ask you a quick question, take about 90 seconds, and then we'll move on to the next person. These are more looking at quotes. So how critical is it to expand the understanding of King as a radical truth teller beyond the nonviolent drum major for justice persona that has been the pervasive point of view through which we examine his work and impact? That's for you, Frank.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm mute myself. Real quickly, 90 seconds are left or less. One of the things that that I gravitate to Dr. King was his persistence in be a truth teller to justice, and how against all odds, he was not only vilified, but even some of his Black ministers really hated him for speaking about social justice and civil disobedience. They wanted to go along to get along. And Dr. King didn't want to promote that type of mindset in the Black community. So I would just basically say that, you know, when he said he can no longer remain silent about because America is a purveyor of violence. I think that for me is profound in how he was trying to get our country to come in understanding justice.
Stay there. You actually raised a point I want to go to next about the purveying of violence. So Blaine, none of his nonviolent approach. So known for his nonviolent approach, Dr. King is also quoted as saying, "A riot is the language of the unheard." Consider that quote in the context of the social justice uprising we experienced this summer. So I want us to discuss this quote, and let's think about this summer as it relates to left-wing extremists, domestic terrorists who participated in the siege of the Capitol building 2 weeks ago, and some would say throughout the course of the summer.
Can you?
I'll say it again.
Yes.
So I wanted to look at pretty much the quote, Dr. King's quote, "A riot is the language of the unheard."
Yeah.
Consider that quote in the context of the social uprisings we experienced this summer.
I mean, I think about it. It brings me back to school and students, because students in my high school and throughout the country were an active part of, local and national, quote unquote, upheaval, uprisings. And in large part, they were not rewarded, not recognized for this. But I also think that they were not encouraged to do that work in school. It is important that activism has a place outside of school. It doesn't need to be separate from school all of the time. I'm kind of talking in circles right now, but I agree with the quote. And I think so much about what students communicate to us in the setting of school, about meeting their needs, about what they understand about the world, and about what they are being given in school that is in such misalignment to what they know about the world, and leads to what is often called misbehavior in school, rather than an understanding of them communicating needs that they have.
Thank you. 2 more questions. Aisha, as of yesterday, the Trump era is behind us. However, we probably haven't heard the last of his illogical boast about helping the Black community. He has often remarked that amidst the pandemic and economic hardship, the unemployment rate was the lowest it has ever been while he was in office. Though this may be statistically true, certainly many Black Americans have not felt any financial relief, nor have they experienced increased housing and economic equity, educational, entrepreneurial opportunities as well. What policies and programs would King endorse now to close the wage gap and assist our working poor and middle-class families? 90 seconds, please.
Wow, that's a phenomenal question, especially in this time. And I think economic access to equity is really important during this time. We need to make sure that our families have their housing secured, their food secured, that their needs around internet and access to, devices, technology is secured, job security. So I think if we're looking at it from a lens of access, it's really thinking about economic access. It's really, especially in a city like Cambridge, where we talk about the tale of 2 cities, the have and the have-nots. The have-nots need to have. And to start having really looks like a place of, if you don't have food at your table, we gonna bring you some food, or we gonna get you the money that you need to have those resources. If your internet is down or whatever, we gonna get you internet. And I know that there's some initiatives that are happening at the city level, at the city council level in terms of broadband and all that kind of stuff. But, we just had $500,000 that individuals were able to vote on through the participatory budget, and none of that had to do with broadband, right? So it's like, as we think about and work through the have and the have-nots, and really making sure that our community have the resources that they need, that $500,000 needs to go to that. That $500,000 really needs to go to doing some surveys with our families in our public housing developments and our low income, our housing, our homeless population, and really looking at what are the needs there and how do we do a participatory budget and make sure that those needs get met. And that's where I struggle with this city about, I talk about, Ty Belletti said this, how do we really be a city that walks our talk? We really need to stop talking and actually start putting some action in. And I'm a believer in that. And I know that I'm also maybe a perpetrator of that, right? But I'm working towards not being a perpetrator of just talking, but actually looking for how do I create the action that needs to back up that talk? And that's what we need to be doing as a community,
thank you.
as a district. Thank you.
My last question to Melissa, and then we're gonna, one last point I wanna make. So Melissa, Dr. King, Ella Baker, Baynard Rustin, and SNCC understood the power of pooling the people's power. Protest rallies, marches, sit-ins, and boycotts slowly but surely moved the needle and were a huge part of progressing the civil rights movement. Similarly, the BLM movement has seen huge numbers of people march and protest as it relates to police brutality. What, if any, connections do you see between the two movements? Should leaders of BLM, the call for the defunding of the police or reallocation of police dollars movement, and other activists look to other methods of protest as citizens and consumers to push their agenda?
First of all, since this is my last 90 seconds, I just
Right.
want to thank you. and
Appreciate you.
everyone, because I'm learning so much. And those questions, you should share them because we're learning from those questions. And every question you're including pieces of knowledge that are helping us connect the dots. But towards that question, I just want to say that I see BLM and all social justice movements currently, including the movements for climate justice, as part of the evolution of the civil rights movements of the 1930s to the 1960s, that these movements looked at what folks did during those eras, took on best practices, best lessons, and have implemented what works currently while adding our own twist, right? So, for example, like we organize mostly online, something that was not possible in the past. The organization is largely non-hierarchical, something that was not in the past, right? So we've learned from those lessons, but young people have evolved the movement, and the movement will evolve again onto the future. So I think that there's absolutely an undeniable connection between the civil rights movement and what we're seeing today. And I want to believe, going back to Dr. King, that Dr. King would be a member of a BLM chapter somewhere.
So with that being said, we're going to spend, I want everyone to go around, take 10 seconds, okay? And we're going to start with Blaine, since she's the birthday girl, celebrating her birthday this week. In 10 seconds, leave us with a call to action.
Listen to young people when they speak.
Excellent. Melissa.
I'm gonna echo Mr. Barnes's words because it's so powerful. Racism is white supremacy. Racism is white supremacy.
Aisha.
I'm gonna say walk your talk.
Okay. Brother Barnes.
We must unlearn in order to relearn.
I want to thank everybody who tuned in. I want to thank 22 City View. I want to especially thank Calvin Lindsay, Danielle Jones, and Ty Belletti for helping put this together. This will be re-aired on Friday. Will be aired actually on Friday, January 29th, 2021 at 8 o'clock on 22 City View. It will also be available on the 22 City View YouTube page. My name is Tony Clark. I'm a member of the My Brother's Keeper Task Force. I'm greatly appreciative of being a part of this week with many helping hands, the YWCA, and others. So with that being said, good night. God bless.
However young you are, you have a responsibility to seek to make your nation a better nation in which to live. You have a responsibility to seek to make life better for everybody. And so you must be involved in the struggle for freedom and justice.
When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just is isn't always just is.